In 1998, Slipknot was teetering on the edge of a dream and a nightmare. The 9-piece band from Des Moines, Iowa had just signed a deal with Roadrunner Records, a powerhouse label known for pushing the boundaries of heavy music. It was a lifeline for a band whose members could barely scrape together enough cash for food. At the helm of their self-titled debut would be producer Ross Robinson, a man whose work with Korn and Sepultura had already defined the sound of a generation. But while Roadrunner and Robinson offered opportunity, they also introduced this new level of pressure, one that would push Slipknot to the brink. Now, the band's vision was nothing short of world domination. Sean "Clown" Crahan set the tone for their very first meeting with Roadrunner's team. He shook hands with everybody in the room, executives, assistants, even the label's president, and delivered the same line with unnerving certainty. How does it feel to meet your first platinum artist? Now, this wasn't just bravado, it was prophecy. Clown painted a vivid picture of Slipknot's future, describing hydraulic drums that would soar 15 feet in the air, flip upside down, and shows so chaotic that they would become legend. But while Clown's words built castles in the sky, the band's reality was far grimmer. They were living on ramen and frozen pizza, crammed together in tight spaces, nerves fraying at the seams. Their grandiose dreams clashed with the grind of survival, and the recording studio loomed as both salvation and a potential graveyard. Now, getting to that studio is definitely not straightforward. Slipknot had been sending out demos for months, and Roadrunner's senior VP of A&R, Monty Connor, had listened through several tracks without feeling that spark until he heard Spit It Out. Corey Taylor's vocals electrified the demo, transforming it from this rough sketch into a real statement of intent. But this track was a breakthrough that they actually needed. It not only secured the Roadrunner deal, but also started a wave of industry buzz. Competing A&R reps started circling the band like sharks, hoping to catch a piece of whatever Slipknot was about to become. And one person who bit early was Ross Robinson. Known as the godfather of nu metal, Robinson had the golden touch that had propelled Korn and Sepultura into the stratosphere. And so he heard the demo and immediately knew that he had to see this group live. When he arrived in Des Moines, he found a band that was raw, violent, desperate, not just for success, but for this outlet, a way to bleed out all the rage that had been bottling up. So Robinson saw that hunger and matched it with his own intensity. He didn't want to just record the band. He wanted to capture that lightning in a bottle, so to speak. And so with the ink barely dry on the Roadrunner contract, Slipknot packed up everything they had, climbed into a caravan of dilapidated vehicles, and set out for Indigo Ranch Studios in Malibu, California, not knowing whether they'd return as conquering heroes or just a hell of a lot more broke. When Ross Robinson attended his first Slipknot show, he stepped into a buttload of chaos and intensity. The band didn't just play, they completely attacked the stage. 9 masked maniacs whipped up a storm of this intense energy, with Corey Taylor, the frontman, howling into the mic, while Sean "Clown" Crahan smashed metal kegs with a baseball bat. Percussionists tore through their kits, guitars snarled with down-tuned aggression, and DJ Sid Wilson prowled the stage like a caged animal. And the crowd, a blend of curiosity and terror, didn't know whether to mosh or run. But Ross was totally digging it. He saw them as not just a band, but this force of nature. By the time that final chord had crashed down, he was totally sold. He promised right then and there to produce their debut and sign them to his I Am imprint. But promises in the music business are only as good as the budget behind them, and Slipknot was dead broke. Securing the deal with Roadrunner was only the first hurdle. They also still had to find a way to get themselves and all their gear to California. And their journey to Indigo Ranch Studios in Malibu was pretty damn interesting. Basically, Slipknot piled into a ragtag caravan of vehicles, hauling equipment in a rented trailer so overloaded that it fishtailed violently at anything over 50 miles an hour. They drove for 3 days, a convoy of rusted metal and frayed nerves, crawling their way westward. By the time they rolled up to Indigo Ranch, a secluded studio nestled in the Malibu hills, they were extremely exhausted, but also feeling that anticipation. And the studio turned out to be both sanctuary and prison. The band was crammed into tight quarters, sleeping on top of each other. But things were looking slightly up, because yes, they were still living off of frozen pizzas, but apparently they swapped the ramen out for bargain bin macaroni, though many of us would still opt for option A. But there was never enough food, never enough space, and always too much noise. But for Slipknot, discomfort was nothing new. It was just adding more fuel to the fire. And Ross Robinson wasn't all about the comfort anyway. His methods were brutal, designed to push the band to the breaking point and hopefully beyond as well, according to him. He literally forced drummer Joey Jordison to play until his hands bled, splattering the drum kit with proof of that dedication of his. Ross hurled potted plants across the room during recording sessions, not as a stunt, but as a way to throw a bit of chaos into it. When Chris Fenn needed to produce a certain stomach-churning sound, Ross had him chug gallons of water until he was on the verge of vomiting, and then mic'd up his stomach to capture the bloated noise. And every session turned out to be this psychological and physical war zone. It was like the band members were both soldiers and casualties at the same time. But there were some definite internal fractures in the band, and in the studio they only got worse. Guitarist Josh Brainerd, who had been with the band since the early days, just could not handle the stress. Midway through recording, he quit, and that left a gaping hole in the lineup. The band called up Jim Root, who joined just in time to record Me Inside and Purity, and his arrival did little to ease the tension. Fights broke out, with Clown and Joey getting into explosive confrontations that left instruments and egos smashed, and Ross didn't intervene. He actually believed that all this conflict was just part of the process, a necessary ingredient in capturing Slipknot's unfiltered rage, and the recording techniques also mirrored the madness. For one thing, Ross insisted on using analog equipment, rejecting that more instantaneous and easier route of digital recording. He wanted the grit, the imperfections, the sound of a band coming apart at the seam. He would mic up amps from strange angles, capturing ambient noise and encouraging the band to move, slam, and headbang while playing. And what came out of those sessions wasn't just music, it was an all-out assault. The recording was less about capturing sound and more about just bottling the energy. And by the end of the process, Slipknot wasn't just a band with an album, they were a weapon. Ross was one hell of a crazy producer, though. I mean, literally a hands-on approach. He'd slam into band members mid-performance, knocking guitars out of their hand and shouting, "You could play that shit harder." He was just going for pure blood and sweat. But Slipknot ran with it. I mean, they had nothing else to fall back on. They just played harder, screamed louder, pushed through every single barrier until the music matched that fury that they all collectively were going for. And part of that fury was stoked by a bootleg video the band kept around called Sex, Death, and Mayhem. It was a disturbing montage of animated gore, death, nudie stuff, including the thing that happened to Pennsylvania State Treasurer Bud Dwyer, or something that he made happen himself. And Slipknot used the footage in their Halloween shows, looping that one particular disturbing clip over and over again during the song Scissors. And it was the only kind of provocation that only a band like Slipknot could actually pull off. Part shock, part art, part therapy. That dark energy seeped into the recording process, giving the album a sense of real danger. But no one felt that danger more than Corey Taylor. His vocal sessions became infamous for their intensity. Ross pushed him to the edge, breaking him down emotionally until Corey was vomiting and crying, his body rejecting the trauma that he was channeling. The vocal booth was just a wreck, filled with the stench of sweat, bile, and something darker. And Corey's lyrics became even more and more unsettling. He was just laying it all out there on the mic, going through his troubled upbringing, battles with addiction, and his overall deep-seated anger at anything and everything. His approach wasn't just to perform, but to unravel, to let those listeners hear the sound of somebody just losing themselves and clawing their way back. And the result? Slipknot forged a sound that was a molten fusion of nu metal, death metal, thrash, and hip-hop, all thrown in for good measure. Joey Jordison's drums anchored the chaos, his rhythms blending the metal brutality with jazz-influenced fills that added a surprising layer of complexity. Sid Wilson's DJ work added a lot of texture, scratching vinyl, injecting hip-hop elements that felt like shrapnel against the album's metal foundation. The band wasn't just creating songs, they were building an all-out aural assault experience on all the senses. And that experience would extend beyond the studio. Slipknot's DIY way of doing things led to the development of their now iconic coveralls, each member adopting a number and a barcode. It was all about rejecting that individuality and more about communicating that the band was more than the sum of the parts. And their masks evolved too, grotesque creations that turned each member into a horror movie character. This wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was really like a psychological tool. Just like Buckethead had expressed, same with this band, is that behind those masks, they were free to unleash their darkest selves, to perform without inhibition. But the creation of the album definitely did come at a price. Slipknot was financially drained, living on the edge of poverty. Mentally, they were just broken, relationships strained by the pressure and intensity of the recording process. Fights broke out, tempers flared, and every day at that studio became a full-on battle. But through the pain, they ended up forging a modern metal classic. In the middle of all this madness was Clown, who fell into the unlikely role of being a mediator. When fights would break out, and they often did, Clown would just load the agitated band members into a car and take them on long drives down Melrose Avenue, giving them a chance to blow off a bit of steam. But Clown was not immune to the strain either. He was feeling sidelined in the recording process, where a lot of his creative ideas would get shut down by Ross. But when the album was finally completed, it felt like less of a victory and more like just a pure relief. Their final sessions were a blur of exhaustion. Jim Root had really hurried his guitar parts, but made them work, and they finished just before Christmas, but the break did little to ease their minds. Back in Des Moines, Taylor ended up returning to his day job at the adult novelty shop, the reality of that normal life crashing down around him. And for 6 months, the band waited for Roadrunner to finalize the album's artwork and packaging, and they were stuck in a limbo where they couldn't tell if their time in Malibu had been real or it was just a fever dream. But when that album finally hit the shelves, it was a release in every sense of the word. But salvation arrived in the form of Ozzfest. The offer to join the 1999 lineup came just as the band was beginning to unravel, and suddenly that dream felt real again. This was more than just a tour, it was a chance to introduce them to the world. Before hitting the main stage, Slipknot played this chaotic warm-up show. In a typical fashion, things went sideways. During Eeyore, Sid Wilson headbutted Clown's beer keg twice before the lights went out. And when they flicked back on, Sid lay sprawled on the floor, blood pouring from his mask. The wound was so deep he could see his skull. But he wasn't about to miss his cue. He strapped the mask back on, blood soaking through, and finished the show. Moments later, Clown punched him square in the gaping wound, and Corey Taylor, not to be outdone, grabbed Sid's head and banged it against the floor to the beat of the music. And it was moments like these that fully defined Slipknot. And for Jim Root, these were kind of trial by fire shows. Ozzfest was his first real test as part of the group, and he was still finding his place among the insanity of it all. He had crafted his own gesture mask just days before the tour, adding another layer of surrealism. The crowds were still trying to figure out what the hell to make of them, but it didn't take long for them to really start digging the group. By the time the festival ended, Slipknot had cemented themselves as the breakout act. The band that everybody was pretty unsure whether they just witnessed a concert or survived some kind of wacky exorcism. But with success came scrutiny. The purity controversy hit hard. The track, along with Frail Limb Nursery, was inspired by a fictional story about a girl named Purity Knight, who was supposedly kidnapped and buried alive. And the story, published on the crime scene website, was presented as a real crime case, leading to allegations of copyright infringement. And because of that, Slipknot actually faced the possibility of their debut album being pulled entirely. But despite the legal realities, Corey Taylor maintained his belief that the story was true, a reflection of the blurred lines between fact and horror that defined the way the band worked. To avoid the catastrophe, Slipknot reissued the album with Me Inside, replacing the controversial tracks. It was a bitter compromise, a reminder that even the most unhinged art could also be muzzled by red tape. As the album hit the shelves, early reactions were pretty polarized. Metal critics couldn't quite pin them down, often slapping new metal label on the band's mix of hip-hop elements, turntable scratches mixed with metalcore riffs. And that comparison really pissed off Joey Jordison in particular. He saw Slipknot as something deeper, more like death metal or thrash than the more mainstream-friendly acts like Korn or Limp Bizkit. Slipknot wasn't just about the shock value of their masks and coveralls. They were a movement, a cult forming at the edges of metal's underground. And eventually, they built quite a dedicated following. Maggots, as their fans became to be known, embraced the Nine's twisted worldview, finding solace in the music's rage and abandon. And lo and behold, Slipknot's debut would become a massive success. It hit number 51 on the Billboard 200, which is a pretty big feat for a group that was scraping by just months before. Their single Wait and Bleed ended up earning a Grammy nomination. and the album quickly went platinum. And as a matter of fact, it actually became Roadrunner Records' best-selling debut album in history. And for Slipknot and the Maggots, this was just the beginning. But it was a beginning that would etch their name deep into the granite of metal history. Big shout out to my subscribers. You folks are just frigging awesome. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe, make sure you just give a nice bloody headbutt to that subscribe button. And while you're at it, reach on over there with your head and also headbutt that like button as well. Do it only once, or 3 times, or 5 times, or 9 times, or any odd number of times. And join the family. And I want to thank you so much for watching.